I am going to try to connect the dots. We started a stream yesterday, and I'm going to try to pick up where we left off and describe what was a hypothesis for me in 1983 when I began as a kind of accidental business person, but which I think is now quite proven. And I think you'll all feel quite convinced that there are models. We talked yesterday about new rules for commerce, and I believe I've proven in my own experience how some of these new rules may play out. This is how I describe it as a win-win-win-win-win future, and I'll explain that term as we proceed. As I mentioned, I'm really an accidental business person. While my family was in business growing up, the shoe industry actually, I actually wanted to be an ecologist focusing on climate change. Many of the leading climate scientists that we know today, Jim Hanson's colleagues, were my professors. And I conducted my research on dendroclimatology, which is looking at the evidence of climate change at tree lines, at the edges of the ends of the forest. I wound up, through a sort of a crazy, circuitous route, directing an ecological research institute in the late 70s and early 80s, where I became good friends with Amory and many colleagues who were at the time advancing extremely advanced, technologically advanced strategies for food and energy production and waste treatment without recourse to fossil fuel use, without using pesticides, herbicides, or chemical fertilizers. And these were very, very productive systems, highly, highly productive. In advanced indoor farms, for example, with year-round food growing. But our kind of academically oriented institute fell short of designing an economic model, actually. Not only in terms of application of our technologies, but even for ourselves. My little NGO fell prey to the Reagan budget cuts in early 1980s when among Ronald Reagan's first moves, he slashed funding for renewable energy and organic agriculture research, much of which was underlying our work, and of course it made the competition for private support all the more difficult. And that's really why in 1983 my partner and I set out with 7 cows to create a company to actually fund our research and fund our advocacy work from our own business. The early days, you have to picture 1983 starting an organic yogurt company. Very few Americans were eating yogurt. No one knew what organic was. I often say in the early days we had a wonderful company, we just had no supply and no demand. But today, as was mentioned, it's a nearly $400 million company. We've had a compounded annual growth rate of over 23% for the last 21 years. We are the largest organic yogurt brand in the world. I have other yogurt brands around the world, in Ireland and in France. I work very closely with, for example, Mohammed Yunus on the Bangladesh project and a number of other similar ventures. And of course, as a yogurt company, I buy 140 different commodities, fruits and flavorings and sweeteners, and I sit on many of these companies' boards. I partnered with Danone, as was mentioned, in 2001. Danone is the 7th largest food company in the world. In a very unusual deal where they bought 80% of my company but left me with majority control, which I still have today. I still have 60% voting control, which we could talk about later because it's part of, I think we're going to be talking here about designing new models, and certainly this is one. But today we support over 2,000 profitable organic family farmers, again producing 140 different products on several 100,000 acres of chemical-free farmland around the world. We've donated over $15 million to environmental causes. We are a prime funder of all kinds of organic ag research. And again, in addition to my own company, I sit on the boards of many other companies, including one that is now a subsidiary of Coca-Cola. So I've become friends with and colleagues with Muhtar Kent here, and really I've been fortunate to spend time with quite a few Fortune 100, Fortune 50, Fortune 10 CEOs, and I've been testing this hypothesis out with a lot of these folks, and I continue to believe that this is we have uncovered a model here, which I'll try to explain. I really do believe that it's possible. I should back up and say, I'm certain that socially and environmentally conscientious commerce is really the greatest hope for turning around what I consider to be a cul-de-sac in sort of human evolution. I don't think we're in a dead end, but I think we've gone into a place in terms of our relationship to nature that we need to come back out of. And I think everybody here would agree that no one ever set out to say, let's warm the planet, let's toxify our air, water, and soil, let's deplete our topsoils, let's put 1 million family farmers out of business. These are the externalities, the consequences of a number of small incremental steps that took place over a long period of time. And unfortunately, as we've now heard from yesterday's discussions, I think we all know we don't have that period of time to turn it around. But it's going to be small steps that get us back. We're just going to have to do it a little bit quicker. And I believe, while I do think solutions for the kinds of problems that we've been discussing do lie with conscientious commerce, I have also seen at multiple levels of commerce that the foundations of modern commercial thinking are actually deeply flawed. The foundations themselves are based on, I think, a number of myths. And a serious and deep rethinking about commerce is actually required here. And I do believe it's possible. So if I were to summarize what I heard yesterday, I would say that humans' fundamental connection to nature and the planet is essentially flawed. We have, as I said, gone down a kind of ecological one-way street with us as the center, or even more as the top of a hierarchy, when in fact we're really part of the mix. And I think we've lost our sense of proportion and our sense of connection. These unconscious steps were really based on myths that start with the trivial and then become quite deep when you understand them. So, for example, the myth of waste. We are the one species on the planet who allows ourselves the ability to produce waste that actually contaminates and disrupts all the other species around us. We have the myth of a place called Away, where we send our waste, which I've still yet to discover where that actually is. We have this deeper myth, which is that no one will say these words, but we actually behave as if the earth is a subsidiary for our economics. In fact, so it's there for the taking, it's there for the dumping. We have this sense of entitlement, this myopia. Actually, the exact reciprocal is what's true. All economies have been made possible by a bountiful earth. And so we are actually the subsidiary of this wonderful planet. We have the myth that the planet is infinitely resilient to tolerate whatever we dole out. And again, as we now approach the 9.6 billion who will be here with us 30 to 40 years from now, we are starting to see, in fact, that we're getting the feedback on that myth. And then we have the myth that we've all spoken about, but I just want to put a finger on it, which is, I think, the biggest myth of all, which is the myth of externalities. This allowance, and again, think about what our externalities, the direct consequences of our economic behaviors, they directly result from choices we make in commercial and societal terms. But in economic terms, they don't exist. I mean, they're not on our balance sheets, they're not on our income statements. Therefore, in economic terms, they're invisible. They literally don't exist. And that's an incredible exemption that we've given ourselves. Putting it differently, we've been using what we consider to be free ecological services of air, water, and soil, which are not free at all. And as Jane said, certainly it's clear that we've stolen our children's futures. And so as we think about these issues, and as we understand that we've been spending most of our time talking about the planet, I want to just quickly remind us that actually our flawed connection to the planet and nature actually extends to how we've treated our bodies, which is another component, another part. These are ecosystems that we're walking around with, and we've been quite abusive to them. You all know about the obesity challenges. We've talked about them at length. Just to put a little poignancy to it, a fifth grader today weighs 17% more then that fifth grader, this would be a 10-year-old, weighed when I was that age. I'm 57 years old. It wasn't all that long ago. In a half generation, we have changed the actual physiognomy of ourselves. This is an American statistic, but I think you all see that this is kind of, when Bill said yesterday, I should share a private chat he and I had, when he said we're responsible for 20% of the Earth's footprint, I actually corrected him. I said we're actually responsible for 100% of the Earth's footprint, because the charisma of the American consumer culture is out. You know, it's what the world tends towards. And as we travel around here in Istanbul and see our Domino's pizzas and so forth and so on, I think you understand what I mean. But the reality is we're exporting this kind of behavior. In America, for those who don't know, last summer, the percentage who are obese exceeded the percentage who are overweight. Obesity is 30% over for your BMI, your body mass index. The percentage who are obese exceeded the percentage who are overweight, and the two together make up 65% now. Okay, just to put this in perspective. And of course, the sister of obesity is diabetes. We're aware of this horrifying statistic, which is, again, if you were born after 2000, you have a 1 in 3 chance of being a type 2 diabetic. In my childhood, we never had the words type 2 diabetes. It was called adult onset diabetes because only adults got it. But now, and by the way, this number is 1 in 2 if you're African American or Hispanic. And of course, the pattern of diabetes follows exactly the same patterns of obesity. It's exactly the same. But what we have to understand is, while this is, of course, a deep moral issue, an ethical issue, it's also fundamentally an economic issue. These externalities have come home. We're talking about now $174 billion per year that it's taking to deal with this problem. And of course, this is the least effective form of healthcare. The cheapest form of healthcare is not getting sick. To be treating ourselves after we become ill is, of course, highly inefficient. On obesity, the numbers are equally staggering. For just overweight, we're talking in the range of $72 billion per year. These are AMA statistics. And with obesity, it's now close to $200 billion a year. So I remind us that quite aside from the moral and ethical issues here, there's a fundamental economic dead end here as well. We can't afford this kind of treatment. Now this comes even more sharply into focus when we look at, I think, the great health issue, the great tidal wave awaiting us, which is when we start to understand what we've been doing in terms of toxins, which I believe is going to dwarf what we've seen with obesity and diabetes, but is really a symptom of the same lack of thinking systemically. I won't read through these statistics, you get the general idea. In 99% of tested pregnant women, this is a sort of menu of the compounds that you can now find in cord blood, in cord blood, and this is, in other words, this is what the child, the infant, is consuming at their first breath, even before their first breath. And again, 43 of these compounds were found in not 90%, 99% of pregnant women, and many of these chemicals were banned long before the women were born. A baby born in New Hampshire this morning will have DDT in her tissue, even though it was banned in the US 60 years ago, because these compounds, of course, are highly persistent. They're being still used in other parts of the world. There is no away, as we now know. Another kind of horrifying statistic, and I promise this will not be the depression hour. I will get out of this in just a moment. But I just need to put this in context. This was a study done in 2004, looking for 413 chemicals at the moment of birth in cord blood. 287 were found, and half of which are known carcinogens. Now, I hasten to say they're not at carcinogenic levels, but on the other hand, we have no idea. We only know about the health effects of about 5% of agrochemicals. We have no idea about the cumulative effects. We have no idea about the synergistic effects. And we have certainly no idea about the impacts on children at the time of maximum cell reproduction, 0 to 14. But yet these compounds are present. Now, where this comes home is that in 2010, we have an oncologic panel that was originally convened by Ronald Reagan and reports to the president every year. And the president's cancer panel that was appointed by George Bush, that reported to Barack Obama during his first year in office, came up with the very startling statistic that 41% of Americans alive today, 41% will be diagnosed with one or another form of cancer. This will not come as a surprise to any Americans in the audience because every one of us knows not one, but multiple people dealing with cancer. We have many right here in our audience who have. This was not the case when I was a child, and 41% also represents a trend line. That number was 21% when Ronald Reagan first convened this panel, and so you can do the math and imagine where we will be when 20 years from now. And again, the important thing to understand here is quite aside from the moral and ethical challenges, we're talking, if we were talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of cost to deal with obesity and diabetes, we're talking about trillions of dollars to deal with these cancers. Okay, so this is and now we're finally getting bodies of data. You know, a lot of people say to me, well, Gary, organic's a wonderful idea, but it really hasn't been proven. And I quickly say, actually, I think it's the chemicals that have not been proven. We've been on a 50 or 60 year experiment with our bodies and the planet. The data is coming in, as Amory said yesterday. The early results are not good. This study came out just last summer linking ADHD diagnoses to pesticide exposure. We now have clear studies linking IQ development, brain development, to correlating to exposure under the age of 6. I sit on the board of a summer camp, and the nurse who's been there 30 years tells me that when the parents, after they drop off little Johnny, it's a boys' camp, they then line up at the infirmary to drop off the drugs for little Johnny for the summer. This was not the case. And we now have, published in Pediatrics, a direct correlation to ADHD diagnoses. So if you're trying to understand why this is happening, and you had a non-organic banana this morning, just close your eyes for a second. Because this is, in fact, sadly, this is what you can titrate and find in the tissue of a non-organic banana. This notion that you could wash pesticides off the skin has long since been disabused. We have fungicides, nematicides, insecticides available. And again, we're really not talking about this yet as a society, but from the medical side, it's coming through. And again, this is, of course, linked to these patterns. As we look at breast cancer, for example, it's primarily a Western-oriented disease. You can look at the same demographic, the same racial background, and growing up in different cultures, and see a much higher incidence tied to Western behaviors than to other cultures. And it doesn't just go to toxins. The final sort of depressing bit here, before I get to the hopeful part, you're wondering why did they invite such a depressing guy, I know, is of course looking at another aspect of our modern food production. You've seen this described, these CAFOs, the confined animal feedlots, where about 70% of our beef comes from in the States, and a lot of our dairy. What isn't really understood, there's a lot that one could say about this slide. There's literally nothing natural happening. There's an 0157 H7 E. coli that is a unique strain that was really created by these non-ecological systems. But the aspect of this that I want to draw your attention to is the complete disappearance of omega-3s, which we all know that we need to keep a healthy balance of omega-6 fatty acids to omega-3 fatty acids. We're supposed to be at a rate around, in terms of our evolution, around a 2.5 or 3 to 1 ratio. Most of us are walking around at about a 15 to 1 ratio. If you eat at a typical American fast food place 3 times in 1 week, you can go to a 40 to 1 ratio. And omega-6s are known as pro-inflammatory. Omega-3s, which you would derive, I hope you're taking your fish oil, omega-3s are in fact anti-inflammatory. And there's a theory in oncology now that, in fact, the absence of omega-3s, the anti-inflammatory benefit, may be a contributing factor, since there's only 2 kinds of cells that actually evolve as in our adult form, fat cells and cancer cells. Cancer is being seen as an inflammatory disease. And so, unfortunately, cows grown in these feedlots where there's nothing natural, and I'm not even discussing the fact that they're living in manure up to their knees, and there's the cruelty aspect of this is thinkable, but beyond that, omega-3s are completely gone by the time the animal is ready for harvest, which means, of course, it's very bad for the animal. It's also very bad for us. So the butter, pork, beef, and eggs that looks like it looked when we were children is very much not so in terms of omega-6 to 3 ratios. This is actually startling information for an awful lot of us, but it's quite well understood in the nutritional community. And this is all in the context of what I was trying to say earlier, which is that we've sort of ignored these externalities in the interest of cheap. And what I would postulate and put forward to you all is that cheap food, which is the sort of holy grail of consumer products, is actually not cheap. In fact, when you may not pay for it at the supermarket, but you're paying for it somewhere. And certainly societally we're paying for it. And the ultimate example of this is this issue of GE crops, genetically engineered crops, which is where I'm spending about 90% of my time these days. I'm the chair of a national campaign to get the FDA to label genetically modified foods. Just to sort of frame this and put this in context, in my view, the history of commerce, and again, I'm in the consumer product space, but I think this is relevant to industrial service. I think this is relevant to all aspects of commerce. It's the history of taking. It's the history of, we talked about the East India Company yesterday, but that's been the dominant paradigm. Taking in order to concentrate profits at the expense of somebody somewhere. Taking from the planet, taking from our children, taking from natural resources. And in fact, what ends up happening, the dominant paradigm in consumer products is make it as cheap as you possibly can, and you get there by taking. So for example, taking from farmers. The average conventional dairy farmer in America is losing their shirts right now. Their production costs are actually above what they're getting, their revenue costs are. And so oftentimes in consumer products, the farmer is actually seen as the adversary. Now this to me seems fundamentally flawed. Why would you want to kill off your supply chain? Well, the reason is because there's always been more land, more farmers, more technology. There's always somewhere else you can go. So that's why we've lost 1 million family farmers, because somewhere else you can find those goods. Well, we're obviously hitting the limit and hitting the end of that. And the classic model, again, to underscore this, is that you keep it as cheap as possible so you have a very big gross margin. And with that gross margin, you use it to purchase advertising. And advertising is used to blast messages at all of us, to create, through reach and frequency, awareness, which leads to trial, which leads to repeat trial, which leads to purchase, which leads to repeat purchase. And the holy grail out here is loyalty. And I'll come back to that, but I want you to understand, this is a well-proven, it's sort of the Procter & Gamble view of the world, but the foundation is cheap. And it's out of that foundation that we see now the emergence of this new technology known as genetic engineering. And I want to be clear that I'm not opposed to the notion of advancing nutrition through technology, but in fact we have abandoned traditional breeding practices altogether because of our love affair with this new technology. And the problem is, and you can see the map of the world's GE crops, most of them are coming out of the US. That's because 4 of the 6 leading genetically engineered, the patent holders are American companies. But it's also because, in fact, we have no labeling of genetically engineered foods in the US, whereas 50 other countries, all of your other countries, in fact, all of our trading partners, have exactly that. And so what has happened is, we talked yesterday, the eloquent comment about Citizens United and the acquisition of our government. This has been a brilliant, brilliant model, because these patent holders have not only bought and owned the technology, but they also own the chemicals that the primary 2 genes that have been engineered are either insecticide resistance or herbicide resistance, and these patent holders happen to own those applications as well. These are extremely profitable products. You need to understand the seeds themselves have gross margins in the 70–80% range, and for the non-business people, understand the average consumer product is more like 40%. So it's twice the typical margins that I would know of, for example. But on top of that, of course, with those big margins, they've been able to do massive amounts of lobbying. And in 1992, even before the first of these crops went to market in '96, under then Dan Quayle, the so-called Council on Competitiveness, they were able, with brilliant prescience and great planning, to put forward a doctrine of materiality. That is, crops that the notion was that materiality, something material to be labeled, had to be organoleptic. You had to be able to taste it or smell it or see it. And of course, we can't taste, smell, or see the difference between genetically engineered corn or non-genetically engineered corn. What this means is, again, it's an externality that's invisible to the American consumer. Now, all of this would be fine if these crops were actually delivering benefits, which they're not. We have no proof yet. The promise may be yet to come. We have no proof, no drought-resistant proof, no yield improvements. We have no intrinsic benefits that have yet accrued to humanity from these crops. And yet, what we do know, 16 years after their introduction, is we've had an explosion, for example, with herbicide-tolerant corn and soy, of herbicide use. And again, just so you understand for the non-agronomists, when you breed in the gene for herbicide tolerance, what that means is you can spread as much herbicide as you want because it's not going to affect your crop. And actually what happens is you spread it at other times. You used to spread it pre-season to get a head start on the weeds. Now you can spread it during the season. So in the warmer weather, you get more evaporation, right? More sunlight, more evapotranspiration. And what happens is because these solutions, these compounds go into solution, when the water evaporates, the compounds become airborne. And that's how, and actually, in fact, it's now thought that the primary health impact is probably through breathing, not actually through the food. But in any case, what we do know is hundreds of millions more pounds of herbicides have been used since 1996. This again, here's glyphosate, Roundup as Americans would know it, used since 96. Now this would all be fine, except that nature doesn't wait around to do focus groups to figure out what to do when it's under assault. And we now have an explosion of what's known as herbicide-tolerant superweeds. These are weeds that didn't wait around to figure out what to do, they just evolved. And this map, I actually can't keep up with it now because the latest numbers are 13.4 million acres, 26 states. These are weeds that are known to be so strong they can stop a combine in its tracks. The only way that farmers can deal with these weeds is to go in and manually harvest or crop them, or to use more powerful herbicides, which have now been advanced by a number of companies, including the use of 2,4-D, which is 50% of what we all would know as Agent Orange, although it's a more benign form, to be fair to Dow and DuPont and others. It's a dioxin. It has a lot less dioxins than the 2,4-D we were exposed to in Vietnam. But we already know that this is a major problem for biodiversity. We're seeing monarch butterflies now because the use of 2,4-D and the use of glyphosate at record levels is actually killing off milkweeds. So we're killing off our pollinators. And again, what's happening is here, if you understand, this is sort of the nuclear equivalent in agriculture. We build resistance, then we use what they call the cavalry, stronger and stronger herbicides, then we build more resistance. And literally a 2,4-D resistant corn has now been introduced, which we're fighting, and I think we've managed to hold it off for a little while. My point simply is that we probably, this is all worshiping. It was said very well yesterday. Just to remind you, these companies are playing by their rules, by the rules, and this is what we really have to talk about. These companies cannot be faulted. They're doing what one does when your primary motivation is short-term returns, but yet at the same time they're using their largesse to suppress transparency. And so a number of scientists and I have written a book. You can download it. You get an e-book version of everything I just described to you called Label It Now. I can tell you about it later. And again, this is the campaign. Now, this campaign has 1.2 million people who signed on in 6 months. It's 2.5 times the largest number of people who've ever signed on with the FDA in its history. And I mention this, and I'll come to this now as we go to some of the solutions, because really the question I think before us is, how do we persuade large business to internalize externalities? I believe that's really the challenge. How do we incentivize the accounting of these unaccounted for costs? And I must tell you, I don't actually believe after 30 years in commerce that moral or ethical persuasion is enough by itself. I don't even believe that the societal costs that I've shared with you are going to be enough, because I think individual companies, as we've seen, can still pretend to be part of the solution while worsening the problem. We have large beverage companies who, of course, have been very big supporters of Michelle Obama's Let's Move campaign, but at the same time are moving massive amounts of sodas into, which is, of course, a principal causality when it comes to obesity and diabetes. And again, these companies' incentives are fixed on short-term profits and growth. And to coin a word yesterday, the monster, I just believe the issue is giving the monster the right rules. We need to change the incentives. And I believe that the two primary levers are going to be showing improved profitability and increasing consumer demand, or leveraging consumer demand, the stuff Bill was talking about yesterday. And I believe I've proven the former. I've proven, as I'm now going to show you, the superior profitability of a more ecological model of internalizing externalities. And I believe I see a way to get to the latter. So let's again just try to summarize what we've covered. There really was a watershed that in the 1940s that has led to this epidemic of cancers. We've had dramatically increased sugar consumption. We have, as was mentioned yesterday, a whole different approach to, we're sitting still a lot. We're looking at screens. We're not being physically active. This is an actual ad. I'm sorry for those in the back who might not see it. This is an actual ad from Life magazine when I was a child. The song is DDT is good for me. So we have had increased chemical exposure. And of course we have this other issue with omega-3s and omega-6s. And the four of these synergistic impact of this kind of ecosystem has put us in this place. And I just want to underscore is how pernicious this is. This is the current pyramid of food recommendations, federal food nutrition recommendations. And to be fair, they've been keeping up. This pyramid has dramatically evolved since I started in business. Now we're supposed to eat, for example, 11 servings of grain, 9 servings of vegetables, 6 servings of proteins, and a lot less sugar, oil, and salt. However, when you look at the subsidy pyramid of what we're actually doing, policy-wise, you will note some striking differences. And in fact, just to help you along, I just point, here's grains, which we're supposed to be eating more of. This is actually what our federal policy is currently subsidizing. Here is meat, dairy, etc., 74% of our federal subsidies. Here is sugar, oil, etc. We're supposed to eat very little of it. It's about 11% of our subsidies. You get the general point. And what I would say to you very simply is that we have a lag. And this is exactly where we have to get to. Commerce, playing by its traditional rules, is not going to be commerce is not going to advance this on their own, this notion of internalizing externalities. If I could put it even more simply, the status quo, companies in power who control the purse strings of the US economy and policy, made their money in the 20th century when a lot of what we know now, we didn't know then, or was unconscious or was buried. And so the issue to me is, again, expediting evolution. How do we do this? Again, I think proving better profits. Oh, by the way, fruits and vegetables, I meant to point this out. It's supposed to be about half of our diet, 0.37% of our subsidies, just for the record. And by the way, I might mention to you that organic receives no subsidies, even though it's 6% of U.S. food. It's a $31 billion sector, etc. So what I would submit to you is that this is deeper than how we behave. This is how we think. And I think that's clear from yesterday's conversation. And the best illustration I have of this comes from World Wildlife Federation. If I asked you how much water was in this cup of latte that you might have had this morning, you would reasonably say in U.S. equivalents maybe 16 ounces or so. In fact, the footprint of a cup of coffee is about 208 liters of water. This is not a surprise to this audience. The toxic, the water, the carbon footprints of virtually everything. Bill said it yesterday. It's our supply chains. Our supply chains are where it's at. Stonyfield's total carbon footprint, 11% of our footprint is in how we manufacture. 89% is in how the food is grown. is in the supply chain coming in. But by the time you add up the water needed to grow the coffee, to grow the grain, to feed the cows, etc., plus all the industrial uses, it's obviously an immense footprint. Amory's been talking about this for decades. And so as we launch into the solution part of this, I want to put in perspective on a transect of moving towards more sustainability. I see it as a kind of a 4-step process. The first step would be just getting your facility, your business into compliance. Many of us are doing that. If you're not in compliance, you get fined or you get sued. That's not a good use of your money. Step 2, which we're starting to get into, is looking at your facility in terms of reducing your energy load, your carbon load, your toxin load, your water load. And again, many of us are doing this. This is common sense. Inefficiency, getting rid of inefficiency is the #1 job of any business person. Step 3 is looking at the supply chain, which, as I mentioned, is really the dominant part of our footprint. Where I would propose to you is all of these are sort of foreplay to where we need to get to, which is a different way of thinking, which is what many of us would refer to as cradle to cradle. A place of no waste, internalizing the externalities. The whole notion of a new way of thinking, which I'm going to show you examples of that. Now most companies, even the largest companies among us, and was mentioned yesterday, are doing an excellent job here in steps 2 and 3 in terms of footprint reductions. But when it comes to climate, when it comes to water, when it comes to toxins, we are not going to solve these problems by lessening our use. We're not going to solve these problems by slowing down our use. All we're doing is postponing, kicking the can down the road. The answer is we actually have to take carbon out of the atmosphere now and sequester it, put it back into the ground. We need to engage in restorative industry, restorative commerce. At Stonyfield, I took this pretty seriously. I already mentioned my background is in climate change. And so early on, we convened 9 of what we call our MAP teams. This is what we call our Mission Action Program. And we measured and identified the 9 largest carbon footprints in our business. The largest being the cows, the burping actually, the methane emissions. And the 9th largest is the acronym in the upper right called Stonyfielders Walking Our Talk. That's the commuting miles and the food that we feed our employees, the services we provide. And between #1 and #9 are water, transportation, waste, efficiency, green chemistry, packaging, etc., etc. And by identifying these 9 teams and then convening panels for each 9 areas and convening teams for each one, made up of cross-functional, every team has someone from marketing, sales, engineering, finance, HR. By approaching these from an integrated perspective and giving them an incentive, which gets back to my point about we need to change the incentives, and in this case it was profit sharing, we gave them bonuses to reduce our footprint. And I don't have time this morning to walk through all 9 of these, though I promise you I could spend all day today talking about the results. And what's beautiful about this, I want to underscore, is while we, from a top-down perspective, set up the teams, the data I'm going to show you now is came strictly from the teams. But to put a punchline to it, in the first 6 years of these teams, since I convened these teams, they have generated $24.3 million to my bottom line. Real money. I'm a $400 million company. You understand this is serious dollars. This has been, by the way, right through the recession, right through a time when most industry has been at a standing place, and certainly most of our profits have been flat or shrinking. As an example, all of our production that goes to the west of Chicago now goes by train. 1/14 the carbon footprint, 1/16 the cost. I have hundreds of examples of these. I want to simply make the point to you that from a bottoms-up perspective, when we shifted the incentives and we said to people, and the New Hampshireites will understand this, but for the rest, you have to understand, New Hampshire, our motto is live free or die, okay? It's a libertarian state. People are not interested in being told what or how to do. The bumper stickers in my parking lot do not conform with my own political views by any stretch. We have more guns per capita than any state in America. You have to understand the population I'm dealing with here. I have many folks who thought this was crazy Gary talking about climate change, which doesn't even exist. But tell me about money. Tell me a way to save money. Tell me a way to boost my profit sharing. Well, these are the heroes in our company. All the profit sharing, the bonus checks that have gone to all my employees for the last 5 years have been generated by these teams. And so one example, and I know Salim will talk about this in our panel, but one example, one of our teams looked at our waste treatment challenge. Now I produce a lot of BOD, a lot of biological oxygen demand. And the traditional myth of waste treatment in modern technology is that the solution to pollution is dilution. We take our biological waste, we put it in water, we oxygenate it, we agitate it, we add some chemicals, and then we eventually are left with something called sludge, which we send to that mythological place called away. When I went to the local authorities who said, I have to build one of these traditional plants, I said, well, I'm going to produce 1 truckload of sludge every single week at my loading. Where does it go? And they said, oh, it's very easy. You send it to Vermont, our next door state, which was, of course, their definition of away. And I was picturing Ben and Jerry's in Vermont, you know, sending it back to New Hampshire, and thinking, well, we could have these sort of sludge exchanges on the Connecticut River and have. Well, I didn't want to be a net exporter of sludge. Obviously, it's an enormous waste product and a huge, by the way, carbon loading for me to truck it out of here. So we built an anaerobic facility. Amory and I were focused on this stuff in the 1970s. Ecological waste treatment plants, which in this case produces a biogas, a burnable gas that we actually use to run our facility. What I can tell you is, without taking you through all the data here, is we've had a nearly 100% reduction in sludge. We produce, we believe, 1 truckload of sludge every 5 years instead of 1 every week. But more than that, we've had a 50% reduction in operating costs, a 30% reduction in our carbon footprint, enormous reductions in water usage, labor, energy. This is actually a net energy producer. We produce the energy that we need to keep this at ambient temperatures in the winter, and we cogen, we produce electricity for the rest of the year. So to put it in more simple terms, this plant cost me $600,000 more than the traditional mythological plant would have. And I got that investment back on month 14, which meant that on month 15, this was making me money. It's a classic example of win-win-win-win thinking, and by integrating innovation. So again, going back to my chart here, the place we need to play is here. And the ultimate way that I think we can play is in front of us. That's what I was saying yesterday. It's here. For example, working with a division of Cargill, we have developed a plant-based polymer for our packaging. You know, we're very proud of the fact that we've had enormous gains on recycling packaging. 72% of the waste that goes out of my plant goes out as recyclables. We've saved ourselves lots and lots of money by not sending to landfills. But actually, what people don't talk about, and most American consumers think recycling is the greenest thing that they do, but in fact, there's an enormous footprint in recycling. When you melt, shred, collect, reform, you're actually generating more carbon that, in fact, in most cases, you don't get back. So what we have done here is we've begun a process of moving towards the ultimate dream, which is, for me, when you finish eating the yogurt, you'll eat the cup. And you know, if you think about an ice cream cone, that's not such a crazy idea. And in fact, already we have a cup that bacteria will eat, and I believe that we're within 3 years of having a cup that humans can eat as well. This is the way we're going to be. This is 4th stage thinking. There cannot be waste. The dyes, the inks, etc. are already organic. This polymer here, this plant-based polymer, we got a 48% carbon footprint reduction. It can be returned to the earth. It's corn-based, which is not the goal. Within about 16 months from now, it's going to be made from methane. This is polylactic acid. It will be made from either ag wastes or switchgrass, or even possibly from the waste products of our waste treatment plant, because you can actually take that sludge I mentioned earlier and the methane and actually produce this product. Now, the ultimate example of cradle to cradle is organics. And so let's just spend a moment and understand, before I get into the sort of science and ethics of organics here, understand that this is great economics. Organic food has been outgrowing conventional food over the last decade by several orders of magnitude. Even through the recession, people say, well, gee, it's more expensive. But look, I mean, there was a dip in the heart of our recession, but it still outgrew conventional. Now, admittedly, it's from a smaller base, as I already mentioned. it's 6% of U.S. food. But on the other hand, $31 billion, it's a significant contributor to our exports, and obviously a job creator for us. It also, by the way, is a way of restoring our family farmers. This chart shows you what I pay my farmers for milk versus what a farmer would receive for conventional milk. So if you were a conventional milk grower, you're on this sort of roller coaster ride like this, where generally over the course of your 20 years, let's say, in this case, 21 years, most of the time, the price you're getting is actually below your cost of production. This line on the top is what I've paid, all the way back to my point. We begin with the myth of cheap, and cheap puts your supply chain out of business. What I set out to do is to say, look, we need these farmers. These farmers are going to sequester. They're going to put carbon into the soil. They're improving water quality, eliminating toxins. They're really contributing to national health care, national security by reducing our dependence on imported fuels. We need them around. So we start off paying them a higher price, which of course I don't necessarily can't pass all the way back. I can't pass a 39% premium back to my consumer. I'll come to that point in a moment. What I want to underscore here, and again, forgive me for this, for those who can't see, but the punchline here is our farmers earn 80% more at the bottom line than they did when they were not organic. They earn more than their non-organic neighbors. Their animals, by the way, live 2 to 3 times longer because they're mostly grass-fed. You know, these are herbivores, not carnivores, and yet we somehow, like we're feeding fish, we're finding these new uses for corn. Speaking of the girls, one thing you should understand, back to my earlier point about omega-3s, is when you move the animals to more grass-based, and we've been doing this with a project we call the Greener Cow, we've dramatically reduced enteric emissions, the burping, on average by 12%, but on peak somewhere around 20%. Methane is 23 times more impactful over time as a global warming contributor than CO2. So 20% reduction is very meaningful. But we've also dramatically improved the omega-3 content of the milk. This is, of course, why the animals are living 2 to 3 times longer. They're healthful. This is, again, good quality milk. This is actually health enabling, not less bad for you. The cows love it, the farmers love it, and frankly, if every dairy farm in the US just did this, just moved their cows to more grass or to flax, high omega-3 fatty acid grains, it would be like taking 500,000 cars off the road, just to put this in perspective. Our milk purchases alone result in these kinds of statistics, and I won't, again, go through them all, but you need to understand this is the ultimate in win-win-win economics. I mentioned earlier the comment that, you know, people have said organic isn't really proven. I really believe that future generations are going to look back at us and say, you were doing what? How were you feeding it? You're dumping chemicals in your air, your water, your soil, on your food and then eating them? What was wrong with you people, right? I mean, I do think this is not we've only been on this dole for 60, 70 years. This is why I call it a cul-de-sac. The ultimate example of this, I'm going to express with this one here. This, to me, is the perfect answer to what Jane spoke about yesterday. What you're looking at on this slide is about 50,000 acres of organic sugarcane in Brazil. Now, the tradition of sugarcane production is that you burn the fields before harvest. You go in and you get rid of, because there's a lot of photosynthesis required, a lot of surface area of leafy matter to produce and concentrate these carbohydrates to make the little bit of cane relative in relative biomass terms. And so in our limited human evolved brain, we see that leafy matter as waste, so we burn it, which of course is a carbon release of a high order of magnitude. It's an enormous carbon cloud that we send up. It's also doubly immature of us because any nutrient matter that was built up in the topsoil during that growing season is also volatilized and sent up, which means next year we have to replace that fertility with something synthesized that came from, in our case, Venezuela, natural gas-based fertilizers. Our farmers said, this is ridiculous, this is highly inflationary. So in 1997, they converted 3,000 acres to organic. This was so successful that today it's now over 40,000 or again, roughly 18,000 hectares. What they did was they went in and said, let's stop burning. Let's chop up the leafy matter and put it into the soil. They green harvest, they don't burn. They generate waste streams now that are used for soil building and for power generation. They've integrated biological pest control systems using biodiversity as their means of controlling pests. And they've completely reconfigured their fields to avoid soil erosion. Well, the net results of this, and here's just an image to show you what's going on. Here you see the harvesting of the organic matter. The sugar cane going into the dump truck. This is me describing a clump. It's a meter deep. In the US, understand that 50% of the topsoils that were here when Lewis and Clark made their way across are no longer here. They're in the bottoms of oceans somewhere. Because of the erosive effects of wind or water. Many of us have been in Beijing. We see the topsoil flying by us right at eye level. Here, you'll note the topsoil isn't exposed to the erosive effects of wind or water for even 1 second. In fact, this whole thing is all about building soil. The tires under these dump trucks are low PSI tires, so they don't compact. You can drive right over your foot. And my colleague showed it to me. I couldn't believe it. The harvester that you see in the back has low PSI tires. So the net result is they're enhancing and creating biodiversity here, which you see an example of it in the bottom. You're standing in the middle of these fields, and eagles are flying by, and cougars are wandering through. It is an eco-agricultural system. Well, here's the punchline. The green harvesting has saved an enormous amount of wasted CO2, incredible amounts of water. They've had a 90% reduction in pest damage since they were non-organic. They have had 312 species have returned to these fields. I want to just pause for a moment and tell you, I have organic dairy farmers in the Central Valley in California, where not known as an organic paradise, okay? And I have stood on my organic farmers' fields, and there are birds and bees and butterflies zooming all over the place, like the seagulls here. This farmer took me in his pickup truck, drove me to his cousin's non-organic farm a quarter mile away. We got out of the truck, and he said, "Do you hear anything?" And I noticed there was nothing flying around. The wildlife, again, did not wait around to do focus groups to figure out where to go. 312 species. This is an incredible system of biodiversity. Groundwater, not only quality, but volume has actually improved, because by putting more carbon in the soil, they are now trapping the rainfall so that it isn't evaporating up. Central pivot ag systems in the US, irrigation systems, 60 to 70% of the water never even reaches the roots of the crops, because water has always been free. Well, it's no longer free. Now it's the oil of the 21st century. And here we have, just dramatic metrics that show the effectiveness. The carbon content in these, underlying these fields is now almost equal to the native forests that were there when the colonists first came out. In nature, it takes 10 years to build an inch of topsoil. Here, they're building inches of topsoil per every 2 years. They've had 10% increase in yields. These farms are producing more sugar per hectare than when they were non-organic. And here's the ultimate economic punchline. When I first started buying organic sugar, it was 100% more expensive than my conventional. Obviously, I couldn't pass that on to the consumer. Today, it's exactly at parity with conventional sugar. And those lines are crossing. Their yields are up, and their inputs are down, and the other system is on the way down. Now, were it not for ethanol subsidies, we would actually be dramatically cheaper. And by the way, this is true of every other commodity I have. Now, I'm exploiting the sugar example, but I told you earlier, I buy 140 different ingredients: vanilla, sugar, cocoa, bananas from Costa Rica, etc., etc. Every last one of these would be an example I could show you. And what I want you to understand, again, along the lines of organic isn't proven, is we now, at this stage in our evolution, and understand that the organic food industry didn't even exist when I started. You couldn't use the words organic and industry in the same sentence, even though it's the oldest form of agriculture there is. Demonstrating longer shelf life of organic strawberries, higher antioxidants, better organically farmed soils, greater total carbon and nitrogen, greater microbial biomass, greater resilience to stress, higher concentration of micronutrients, understand that in conventional agriculture, when we put a prescribed fertilizer dosage on the land, we're limiting the nutrient input to the macronutrients that we've put into those compounds. We're missing a whole range of micronutrients that our bodies actually need. Side-by-side comparisons of organic now, we're finally getting out. This is out of Iowa State University, a study that's been running for 14 years, showing similar yields to organic, to conventional, but much higher economic returns and improving soil quality. And again, we're talking sequestration. We are going to have to, we cannot solve the climate change problem by slowing down. We have got to take carbon out of the atmosphere. That's what we're talking about here, putting carbon back in the soil. Rodale Institute has now shown 30 years of trials, side by side, corn growing, one of the most nutrient expensive crops there is, side by side. Higher yields, higher soil quality, more drought resistance. This on the left. These patches, by the way, are 50 meters apart. During a drought year, you can see the corn, the organic corn to the left, the conventional corn to the right. So this is not just, a child of the 60s here talking, right? Somebody who, as I often say, wasn't exhaling back then. This is science. This is land-grant research. And it goes further. International studies are now concluding. The UN Human Rights Council report is now saying this is how we're not going to feed Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, with conventional methods. Farmers can't afford these methods, and you're getting higher yields. These are much better tailored to, for example, the average Turkish farmer, whose average herd size here in Turkey is 1 cow. Okay? You're not going to impose a lot of technology into that economic system. The UN Environmental Program, in a report called here, the middle report, showing that 24 African countries established that organic or similar farming methods produce over 100% higher crop yields for that ecosystem, for that bioregion. Another report out of the UN. The FAO just came out just 3 weeks ago saying the only way we feed Sub-Saharan Africa is with organic and sustainable methods. So again, I think where we are at this moment is we're in the flush of reviewing the data from this 60-year experiment, while we're now finally beginning to meter and chronicle this really 25-year-old old form of agriculture. Now the final piece I mentioned earlier, so I believe I've established the higher profitability. And again, I understand this is food, and in a moment we'll hear from a cement manufacturer, and I think I sit on many corporate boards. I believe this paradigm of higher profitability by internalizing externalities can be applied to any business. And if you don't believe me, you'll hear this afternoon from the master, Amory, who has made a career of proving this to be true. But I mentioned the other lever is moving the consumer. And I do believe that because of this lag, because again, the status quo is not going to move things along, whether with organics or nuclear or oil, or because this is where they evolved. So I believe we need a pull-through. If you will, I think we have the carrot, which is the profits. We need a stick. And Bill talked about it. And I don't believe that you have to get necessarily arrested to make this happen, although, again, he'll make the case that helps. Let me bring you to the final point and talk about the consumer. Earlier I said that the history of consumer products begins on a foundation of making the food as cheap as possible. And the net result is that you can then fund this whole paradigm of advertising, reach, frequency, trial, repeat trial, purchase, repeat purchase, and the holy grail, which is loyalty. Now, let me tell you a quick anecdote. I was standing in Florida about 4 years ago. I was holding a competitor's yogurt. And I was reading the label, and a little old lady came up to me and tugged me on the elbow and said, "Young man, somebody your age really should be eating the Stonyfield instead of that stuff." This really happened. And I said, "Why, Mom?" No, it wasn't my mom. I said, "Why is that?" And she said, "Well, do you know that they give 10% of their profits to environmental causes? Do you know they were the first dairy in America to pay farmers not to use synthetic growth hormone on their cows?" She said, "Do you know that they offset all the emissions from their manufacturing?" And this is, she was not wearing berets or Birkenstocks or tie-dye. This was, a regular average American. I said, whoa, how do you know this stuff? And she said, well, to tell you the truth, my husband died of colon cancer 6 months ago. I'm quite confident it was because of our horrible diet. And the girls and I, she was referring to her bridge club, her card playing club, all of us have lost our spouses, and we all have grandchildren who we want to see go up and get married and have kids and start businesses. And so we're now reading labels. And again, the internet democratizes all of this, expedites evolution. She said, I go to the websites of the companies. If I'm going out to buy yogurt, I go to the website. And here she was accosting a total stranger. She taught me everything I ever needed to know about marketing. Of course, I hired her on the spot. That isn't actually true, but I did give her a lot of coupons. But I want to put this in context. My gross margins, my margin after my cost of manufacture is 1,000 points worse than Dannon's and Yoplay's. But my net margins at the bottom line are better than theirs. I want to say this again. At the gross margin line, I'll tell you, my gross margin is 30%. So my cost of goods is 70% of my revenue dollar. My net margins at the bottom, after accounting for advertising and overhead, is better than theirs. What happens? Somewhere between gross margin and net margin, I made it up. And this, to me, is the proof of my hypothesis. And if you look at the last bunch of years of advertising, you'll see Dannon and Yoplait, the leaders, spending between, let's call it 5 and 10% of their revenues on advertising, with this paradigm of blasting us into submission with messaging. Public radio listeners love to hear this, by the way, Kristen, because of course this is the argument for NPR versus commercial advertising. Here's my advertising spend. It's a rounding error. Okay, I don't advertise it. That's how I make it up. That's how I make up the gap. I do the right thing, and the little old ladies come to me, like the lady in Florida. And so since we can't compete on advertising impressions, we have put forward a whole different approach to marketing. And I just want to keep the thread here and keep this in context. Cheap food is not. Cheap products are not. When you do it right, when you build it, they will come. But you do have to communicate. And so we have employed a wide range of technologies. This is, for example, my yogurt cup, which looks like a simple yogurt cup, but in fact, there's all kinds of messages in here. It's the #1 point of contact for me with the consumer. Jane and I partnered on this, 20 years ago. We promoted the Jane Goodall Institute and drove membership to her. Of course, the kids loved the association with Jane and all the creatures. But we talk about what we do on our packaging. This is our advertising. We use our lids, the yogurt tops, to communicate messages. When Al Gore, we were talking yesterday about Kyoto. What a lot of people don't remember is when the Clinton administration actually debated for a while whether to go to Kyoto and whether to sign, we published Al's email address on our lid and said, urge him to go down and sign. Well, he told me that he got something like 30,000 emails. And this was, in the early days of the internet. I mean, he had only just invented it at that point. But we use these lids to talk about the causes that are important to us. And so my favorite was when the Gingrich Congress came in with what they called the Contract for America. I call it the Contract on America, because they were talking about slashing funding for clean air and clean water. Our lid said, Congress, have you flipped your lid? And then you flip it over, and there was a letter you could sign, and you wrote, Dear Congressperson X, I believe in an efficient government, but not at the expense of my children's futures. If you vote against the planet, I will not vote for you. At the time, Dick Gephardt, the House Majority Leader, told me that 15,000 lids alone came to his office. Now, this is a fantastic way to go. It doesn't always work perfectly. I will tell you, I had one incident when Nancy Pelosi became the Speaker of the House, and she insisted on having organic yogurt in the cafeteria. So we got it. It took us a while to negotiate to get it in there. It happened, unfortunately. Every year I do one lid on campaign finance reform, which you heard yesterday is one of my passions. It happened that, unfortunately, when she said we need healthier food, and I said, well, we'll deliver it, the very week that my yogurt got on Capitol Hill, my lid said this: in politics, the cream doesn't always rise to the top, which was my way of protesting against the fact that you shouldn't have to be a millionaire to run for Congress. Well, this is the return receipt for all that yogurt. They sent it back to me. I loved it. The letter that came back said, "Dear Gary, we love your yogurt. Just change the lids. We'll take it in. But these lids are too political for Capitol Hill." I thought that was one of the great lines of all time. When we were trying to break into the Chicago market in 1989, they told us that we had to get to a 3.5 market share within 90 days in order to stay on the shelf. Now, by traditional methods, that would have cost me about $10 million of advertising, which of course I couldn't spend because I'm paying the farmers the right price. So I went to the Chicago Transit Authority. I developed a lid that said, "We salute your commute." I went to the Chicago Transit Authority and said, "Can I thank people for riding the trains by giving them a yogurt?" They thought I was crazy, but of course, when you take the train to work, you're avoiding the production of 45 pounds of particulate into the atmosphere. So we greeted these poor, bewildered commuters here in Chicago by handing them a yogurt, a spoon made from recycled yogurt cups, and a coupon. 85,000 commuters sampled our yogurt in 72 hours. We had a market share of 2.9 at the end of 3 days for a cost of $100,000 versus $10 million. The Today Show came down and filmed the crazy yogurt people giving out yogurts. So then we went to Texas, where they don't really believe in trains, at least for passengers. And we know that if America kept our tires properly inflated, we can get a 3 mile per gallon increase in national fuel efficiency. So we stood on the side of the road in San Antonio with big signs saying, "We support inflation." And people would pull up and we would inflate their tire, give them a tire gauge, give them a yogurt and a coupon, and again built our share. This is when we enter new markets, we go win with public transportation. And again, we jump right to this loyalty. We jump all the way by skipping those steps. So we did not on a foundation of cheap. By the way, we learned this early on. If you sent in 5 yogurt lids in the early days, this first supermarket said to me, "Well, what are you going to do for advertising?" And I couldn't afford advertising. I was paying the farmers, and I told you the sugar was 100% more expensive. So I put cows up for adoption. What happened was you could send in 5 yogurt tubs, and the cows you would get a certificate naming you the co-owner of a cow. You would get a photograph of your cow. And then in those days, the cows would send you 2 letters per year. Actually, now we've gone paperless. The cows send you 4 emails per year. Some of them are tweeting and blogging. But we've had hundreds of thousands of people who've adopted cows live on national television. We thank and congratulate Congress people when they get elected by giving them a cow. When the cow dies, we send them a note that says you can now have a stake in your cow. No, I joke. Sorry. But anyhow, the point is that we're limited by our imaginations in terms of communication. The dominant paradigm of needing to purchase expensive media, which by the way is no longer working as well anyways. Most leading consumer products folks will tell you that. So it fits beautifully. And the question yesterday about the internet and the democratization is in fact the avenue available to fuel this whole paradigm. Because now, when you go on the net, you'll see my farmers with their farm cams. I have given my farmers flip cameras. My marketing is how it's grown. My basic paradigm is peace of mind. My number 1 reason that consumers buy my products is having children. The number 2 reason, close behind number 1, is having a health event, having cancer. And so people go to us, and again, it's 6%, although in produce, it's 12% of U.S. produce is now organic. It's now finally hit double digits. So here, you can go on my website, and the farmer will show you how you can literally watch the cows coming in from the pasture. So urbanites love this, kids love this, and so forth. We can visit a Roots and Shoots site. I have something called YouTube, and it's my version of YouTube. You get 2 to 3 to 5 minute videos from celebrities, athletes, doctors, farmers. I can show you strawberry production. I can show you banana production in Costa Rica, where I'm enriching the local community. You can literally visit and travel without moving from your computer to see how it's grown. And of course, social media is ultimately, for us, the numbers are staggering at Stonyfield. When you look at all of our different programs, and I won't belabor them because I'm over my time, I will just tell you the punchline. 2.4 million people joined me last year alone. That is loyalty. And incidentally, an interesting number, 75% of my sales are by 3% of U.S. households. So imagine if I get to 6%. I'm now a $1 billion company. So understand, this is why Coke and Pepsi and Kellogg's are buying up organic companies, because they understand this is truly organic growth. Now, I borrowed this slide from Hunter Levins, so some of you may know it as familiar, but I want to finish with this point, which is as you look through the evolution of commerce, and I think Michael gave us the right context yesterday, thinking about the first commercial venture. You can go all the way back and see that innovation, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, during the panel, we've always had sort of leaps of innovation where we have these breakthroughs. And obviously, we're enjoying the sort of digital revolution right now. But I would submit that we're now in need of and ready for the latest, the next wave in evolution. Organics is a perfect example. Again, I do appreciate, I've been talking about one segment of business, food business, and even one sector, which is consumer products. But I believe whether you're talking about biomimicry, cradle to cradle, or green chemistry, or industrial ecology, we're talking about the same paradigm. Cheap is not. That paradigm is busted. The costs are coming home. The costs of these externalities are here. And to put it a little bit more bluntly to you, there's 1,000 reasons to eat organic food. There's one reason not to, and that's that it's more expensive. And that's a very good reason for the bulk of our world who is not yet, doesn't have the means. But I want to underscore there are two primary ways that I can bring my costs down closer to conventional. But understand I'm never going to get all the way there because that artificial, that fake cheap is not, it's not going to remain, and you're paying for it somewhere anyways. Number one is scale, volume. When I started, I would go over to one farmer here to pick up my milk, and then I'd drive over there to pick up my milk, and over there, 60, 70, 100 miles between farms. And the net cost of that was a high cost per farm of pickup. Now, because of our success, we've picked up 6, 7, 8 farms in one area, so it's low cost. So I get efficiencies with scale. I get better, more effective purchasing, and so forth. But the second gets back to policy, is I'm not playing on a level playing field. We are competing with a subsidized system of corn and soy, which we don't face. We don't have subsidies in organic, by the way, nor are we advocating for subsidies. So this is where we have to expedite evolution. This is where we need consumers. This is why our Just Label It campaign demanding transparency is critical. And this really brings me back to the final point, which is that I really believe ultimately in the power of one. I mean, I do think this is Jane's message. I think this was Bill's message. And I'm not going to break with them. My company is living testament. I promise you I did not get to this point of stature with my deep pockets or my big advertising budget. I was completely broke. I was running NGOs before this. We have learned, I mentioned climate counts yesterday, the Just Label It campaign. We have learned the power of one to pull these products through. A large supermarket buyer told me recently an anecdote. He said that if we do something well and we get 2,000 or 3,000 letters of thanks for doing a good job, it's nice and management deals with it. If we do something poorly and we get 100 letters of complaint, it goes to the board of directors. You mentioned earlier, you're spending a lot of time at your boards dealing with governance. This is how we drive change. This CEO was very clear, and you saw it in Food Inc. with the buyer of perishables who buys $20 billion worth of goods. He said, very simply, it was very easy for us to decide at Walmart to carry organic products. It's because that's what our consumers wanted. So I would submit to you, when you run an item past a scanner, you're voting. I would submit to you that while organic isn't yet accessible to the other 94%, 5 or 6% of it is enough. That Margaret Mead was right, to never doubt the power of a small group of people to change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. My closing comment to this group is, I think successes are contagious. And I believe one of our responsibilities and opportunities is to catalog successes like this and share them. Or to put it much more simply, as Gandhi said it, anyone who thinks they're too small to make a difference I
I believe we create the future one purchase at a time, one individual, one consumer at a time. Thank you very much for listening.
They would always unerringly pick the organic food and reject the non-organic food.
What do they know that we're still figuring out, right?
So we're a little over schedule for all the right reasons in the world, which was an incredible presentation, both educational, entertaining, funny, moving, and inspiring, which Gary always is. If you have a chance later on tonight during the break or at dinner, ask Gary about some of the early days of Stonyfield Farms. I've heard these stories. They're amazing. I think, if I have this right, there was one point when he figured out that he did the math, figured out the more yogurt he made and sold, the less money he was making, which seems counterintuitive, but there is a stage of business, and they're great stories of the early days of Stonyfield. It's an inspiring story. So let's take the next 10 minutes for questions, and then I'll tell you about the break, and then we'll get the panel up here. So, questions for Gary.
Yes, please.
So after you set up your...
A bit louder, please.
Okay.
And we'll repeat the questions.
And we can really open the curtains.
Yeah, let's, folks, why don't we now, if I could ask the students, if you'd open the curtains and windows. We did this to keep the room dark enough for the slides, but let's see if we can cool this place down a little bit. We'll turn off the air conditioning units, which are not working anyway. Oh, they're working over there. They're working in that corner. Everybody move over here.
It's not working here. Yes, sorry, Judy.
After...
Maybe you should stand.
Okay. After you gave bonuses and had your focus groups in your company, you explained that the bumper stickers in the parking lot didn't necessarily reflect your own bumper stickers. What happened to the attitude and the openness and the ability of your workers to
Towards these ideas.
yeah, towards those ideas?
So did you all hear the question? No. Okay. So the question was, my employees aren't necessarily left-leaning or even Democrats, as I am, obviously. You know, they're a wide spectrum of political views. New Hampshire is pretty diverse politically. What happened after some of these successes, after they started getting their bonuses? Well, the classic way to answer that is, I can tell you the head of our transportation team, militant right-wing Republican, thinks Reagan was a moderate. Romney's concerned Romney is not conservative enough. Thought when I sat down and explained to him, he's the head of logistics, that I want him to chair the transportation team to reduce, because I thought the biggest gains could be had on transportation. He said, why me? He said, I don't believe in that stuff. He said, we're not, you know, this climate change is a myth you're pushing on us. It's a, you know, a left-wing conspiracy and all of that. I said, look, Ryan, think of it as saving money and improving your job security, okay? Not just because I'm telling you to do it, but because, you know, we need to enhance our profitability. It's very competitive. He said, okay, I can get behind that. Well, this guy is now the featured speaker at transportation conferences all across the country. Because I gave very short shrift, but we have 100 innovations in transportation. Walmart is, of course, well known for these, but filling the cube, altering our packaging, altering the design of our packs to maximize the payloads and so forth. He still thinks Ronald Reagan is not far enough to the right, but he needs no persuasion that sustainability equals better economics. And I think that's really the point. This organics is not a partisan issue. Ecology is not a partisan issue. This is an issue of deep, I think, morality, of our relationship to the planet, that we have it wrong. But I think that the carrot of economic gain in a world where, let's face it, if you're dependent on fossil fuels, you're fundamentally committed to an inflationary system. It's just financially, that's not a debatable, these are non-renewable resources, let alone all the externalities. So it's, I think, I don't care what he thinks politically. And because that's not of issue. I mean, actually I do care, but in terms of these gains, what I care is that he becomes an apostle, if you'll allow me to use that word, for the financial effectiveness of sustainability. And he's brilliant at it, Amory.
Last week I was talking to the head of sustainable purchasing, supply chain for Unilever, who is absolutely convinced that organic farming cannot feed the world, that we will need more and more chemicals, GMOs, and so on, and steadfastly rejected any evidence to the contrary. Where do you start with somebody like that?
Yeah, well, that's who I spend most of my time with, actually. Let's start at the farmer,
Okay.
and then we'll go to the corporate CEO, because of course, actually, you should know, my biggest problem is my supply chain. It takes 3 years to convert a farmer to organic. You have to have third-party certification that the fields have nothing's been going into the fields. And that's a big leap for a farmer to switch methods that they've been known for their generations, although most of them understand that what we're really asking them to do is to farm like their grandparents with just better technology. I mean, our farmers use GPS technology. To understand, these are not Luddite, technologies, but nevertheless, the answer very simply is I don't try to persuade them. I try to get the other farmers to persuade them. I try to get land grant extension to persuade them. That's why Stonyfield's, I mentioned earlier, 10% of our profits go to environmental causes. But it's not completely selfless philanthropy. We funded the University of New Hampshire land grant. We put the first organic farm on a land grant college so that the extension agents could learn from their own experience, the savory method, the rotational grazing methods, the enhanced animal health, and the nutritional benefits and so forth. And then they become, what I try to do is seed the sort of trim tabs out there, feed the levers, and let the farmers talk to the farmers. Now at the corporate level, it's quite simple, to be honest. First of all, as I mentioned, and the analogy to energy and renewables is obvious, right? I mean, you have this oil infrastructure, or waste treatment. Let's talk about a third area. Tradition of wastewater engineers have learned that the solution to pollution is dilution. That's what they were taught. And so how do you move off that paradigm when, in fact, that's what they know? And the answer is that you have to go back to the data. And now, and honestly, in the last 12 months, we have intrinsic yield studies. The super weed analysis I showed you on GMOs, this is not my analysis. This is leading weed, the 5 leading weed scientists in America have just published a paper calling with alarm that we are now engaged in herbicide, an out-of-control herbicide inflation. This isn't, progressives. These are the folks who are going to ultimately influence the supply chains for the guy at Unilever. So one point is we try to get the science, we try to get in these conferences, we try to expedite the research and get it out there. The second is much more obvious, but at least to me, and that's market share. Maybe I can't persuade him of the effectiveness of organics, but when his consumer is leaving for organics, the other night we had Mr. Koch here. He's obsessed, I don't know if you all know, with bringing a Whole Foods to Istanbul. Why? Because he sees, this is obviously a fairly successful business person. What is he, 11% of Turkey's GDP? 7%, or 11% of the taxes, right. He sees this as the future. The GMO issue is really tough on this, Amory, because the culture is so deep, and if you will, forgive me, the religion of GMOs is so strong, and it's been so beautifully advanced that it really is David versus Goliath. But the data doesn't support his argument. The data, and the land grant people will show you this, that most of the yield gains that we've had in the 16 years since the introduction of these crops are from traditional breeding methods, not from anything to do with GE. And by the way, they don't deny that the weed problem exists. And there's other problems. By the way, the same thing is true with insecticides. There's a BT, a bacteria thuringiensis, that was injected into corn to control the corn borer. And the borers are now becoming resistant And by the way, the BT, which was not supposed to pass into the human digestive system, has now been found in the cord blood of babies. So what I think is happening, and it's happening fairly quickly, is a lot of these myths are crumbling in the face of actual evidence. The issue, again, is expediting evolution, is speeding that up. But it's helpful when the UN backs me up on this and lays out the arguments that just economically that paradigm doesn't work.
Is there a simple compilation of that evidence in one place?
This is a problem. The answer is not really. It's multiple places, and this is, I think, we just convened a 3-day retreat, leaders in the organic industry, to face this exact fact. Having said that, I will tell you that Unilever, Kellogg, Nabisco, Pepsi, Coke, they all own organic companies. They're seeing what's going on with the consumer. They're seeing the yields and the returns and so forth. The problem is that the addiction, the old model of keeping it cheap and buying advertising is all that they know. It's the wastewater analogy. And Danone, the reason Danone, now I can tell you the true story, the whole truth. The reason Danone bought 80% of my company but still left me with control is they were completely bewildered by my model. They didn't understand, how was I making better profits than them with lower gross margins? And so, again, we've been proving there that this really does work. But on the other hand, I admit to you, I call this a 29-year overnight success. It's not as quick as the power of advertising, and that's one of the challenges. Let's get a couple more questions. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Paul, if you want to.
Go ahead. You have a better
Okay. Sure, please. Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I noticed that when I go to the supermarket, that both Danon and Yoplait use gelatin and pectin, but the reason we buy yogurt is it cultivates healthy bacteria in the digestive system.
Right.
So why wouldn't you define those as milk jellos as opposed to real yogurt, because real yogurt can develop a benefit that Jello does not do. I noticed that you
What are you doing the next couple months? No, I mean, I could use you. That's a great point. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that my consumer is, let's face it, is a label reader, is an educated consumer. Just as I think consumer who's buying more efficient cars is, buying with a set of values. And what you're saying is, why don't we use methods to get that out to more and more folks? Well, most folks don't think gelatin's a bad thing. Yeah, and it may not necessarily be a bad thing, although Jane and I could talk to you about where gelatin comes from. But the reality is, why not make it food? That's really your point. I mean, why have fillers and thickeners when you could actually do it with bacteria and real protein? And that's actually the Greek yogurt explosion. It's funny to be standing with a bunch of folks from Greece, because it has nothing to do with Greece, the Greek yogurt phenomenon in the US. It's a strained yogurt, but it's known as Greek yogurt because it's higher protein and lower carbs without resort to artificial stuff. So you're absolutely right. But understand, we're children. We're evolutionarily, intellectually, we're immature in our thinking about our relationship to the planet and to our thinking about our relationship to the bodies. In our minds, if the FDA says it's okay, it's okay. When in fact, less bad for you is not good enough. It has to be nutritively beneficial to you, I think, to qualify as food.
Let's give Bruce the last question.
Okay.
At this point, then we'll take a 10-minute break, and you'll have an opportunity to continue the conversation with Gary, and then we'll pick it up again later.
Do you consider...
Bruce is in the back. Bruce,
sorry. So go ahead, Bruce. I'll...
Although I work for The Economist and I have another interest as a scholar of Orthodox Christianity, I'm going to address you as somebody who's been living in rural Northern Ireland for the last 6 months. An area that is suffering from industrial decline, from the after effects of deep intercommunal conflict, but nonetheless has some promising seeds as well. I know half a dozen small, honourable businesses in my area of the boondocks of rural Northern Ireland who are struggling with all their might to produce local products, local food products, high-quality tourist products in an honourable way. People who weave and tailor textiles, people who make food and generate their own energy and find ways around the fact that we have extremely expensive energy from the grid. So lots of small, honourable enterprises. And yet, we see tourists coming in quite large numbers, and they buy plastic green leprechauns and horrible things. They buy T-shirts, made of the Titanic, made in China. And there seems to be sort of just a huge gap in the power of these small, honourable businesses, and whoever is providing tourists with so-called souvenirs. And any thoughts about how that gap might be closed?
Well, first of all, I know this example perfectly because I run an Irish organic dairy which purchases now Northern Ireland farmers' milk. And actually, Yoplait just pulled out of Ireland 2 weeks ago, which means that my little organic dairy, which is now 12% share of Ireland's yogurt, total yogurt, is now the largest dairy in Ireland. And I believe we are the second largest buyer of Northern Ireland milk right now. And the reason the farmers are switching over is that they can make more money selling to my dairy than they can with the other folks. So just to put this in context. This is a fabulous example, and there's examples throughout, and I know in the panel we'll get into this, and I know we need to take a break, so let me just try to say this very succinctly and not give quite the justice that your question really merits, because I think it needs time. I want to be very clear. I'm not Pollyannish. I built a business that, admittedly, it's 6% share. It's not 60 yet. It is a model, and only a model. I don't pretend that it's sweeping and changing all of commerce. But I offered it up today as a hopeful example that it can be done. I set out with a hypothesis, asking, could it be done in 1983? I've now proven it can be done. I sit on 9 corporate boards in a variety of industries, including the tchotchke industry, as we would call it, the tourist goodies, and restaurants and so forth. And I'm seeing this paradigm repeated across sectors. The central pivot point, again, I offer you is, number one, we need to prove on the industrial side to the folks Emery talks to, the producers, the suppliers, that it's inherently more profitable and it's a competitive advantage. And then if you do it well, talk about it, communicate it. But on the consumer side, the demand side, to your exact point, we don't need 50% share to make this point. Apple, every innovation we've got out there in the world began, with somebody as a niche. You just need a critical mass. And when that happens, you start building. Now, the only issue is that when we're dealing with the issues of the magnitude that we've been talking about the last day and a half, we don't have another 30 years. We have to make it happen faster. Educated folks are my consumer. Educated folks, like the folks in this room, your constituents. The West, we're the ones who have to make the change. We have to expedite the evolution out of the cul-de-sac. We have to speed it up. We're not going to get every last tourist to change from the plastic leprechauns. But I would venture that an Irish-made, Irish-produced, beautifully, with local wool, I don't know what it is, I could think about, brainstorm with you, will have a niche that will grow. That's precisely, we need to put these seeds of hope out there. And we educated folks need to support, and not just the products themselves, but the paradigm. And that's how I think we turn this around.